Hello, freedom lovers. Everybody having a good night? I want to say thanks to Bruce. It's very hard to give a lively introduction to someone. That was entertaining, and it's rare you get an entertaining introduction. I want to thank David for everything he does year in and year out. You know, it's funny, I have always admired David, but just lately I've been feeling this sense of camaraderie with him. You know, if you're an editorial writer, you have to have, by necessity, a very thick skin. And I like to joke that my skin starts here and ends here. I don't even have any internal organs, right? But in the last couple of years, it has just been remarkable. I have never been called as mean of things as people call David, but in the last couple of years, for the crime of writing about the FBI and the abuses of its power, and let's be clear, that is what has happened, I have been called a Russian spy, a traitor, a communist, which makes me laugh, by the way, and every other manner of thing that you can imagine. And David's point when he was up here talking tonight is incredibly important, and it's one of the greatest threats that this country faces at the moment, that our colleagues on the other side of the aisle no longer believe in the First Amendment. They no longer believe in debate or civil discussion. If you disagree with them, their goal is to ostracize you, throw you out of acceptable society, and basically make you a pariah. And we cannot allow that to happen. So it's so important what David does and the Freedom Center. And I just want to applaud all of you for supporting it. I also want to thank Michael, wherever he is, because he does pull all of this off. Extraordinary. Thank you. Not only does he put on an amazing conference, but he is the rescuer of forlorn women. I showed up here today at 2 o'clock. I'd been flying all day since 5 o'clock in the morning, and I got here and they told me that I couldn't get into my hotel room until 5. And I called David up all weepy and said, "David, can you do anything?" And I was in a room in 10 minutes, so... Mostly, I want to thank you all for this glorious weather. Not everyone knows this, but I actually split my time between Washington, D.C. and my home in Alaska. And after you've been in Alaska for a very long and cold winter, and you fly to the lower 48, you begin to appreciate really small things like colors. Haven't seen anything but white in a very long time. People are actually always really surprised when they find out that I live in Alaska. And one of the first things they say is, "Why do you live in Alaska?" And I always say, it's the word right up there on that screen, freedom. We've been having little jokes tonight about California and other states. Well, people, if you want a freedom-loving place, come live in Alaska. It's amazing. No income taxes. They pay me to live there, by the way. We should have more states that try that out. We had a little event a while ago. I live in the town of Wasilla. A far more famous person than I lives in Wasilla, let's make that clear. But a couple of years ago, the city council was having a debate over whether or not to ban snow machines in the middle of town. Because we all ride our snow machines in the middle of town. You're still allowed to do that. And if Alaskans actually owned pitchforks, which they don't, there's not much cause for them up there, but when they got word of this, you should have seen the city council meeting. And let me just say, we're still all driving snow machines through the middle of town. The town I live in is actually the most conservative area I have ever lived in. I am literally the most liberal person who lives in the Matsu Valley. And that will tell you something. But I also get asked a lot. I get asked, how do you do your job up in Alaska? And I always say, well, for one, we have this amazing invention up in Alaska called a telephone, which we have them too up there. But also I point out that probably the most important thing I've ever done for my professional development was to move 4,600 miles away from the place that we call the swamp. It gives you some real perspective. And when I go out across the country and people say, what can we do? There's so many problems in the country. I actually have a proposal. It's probably unconstitutional, grant you. But I would forcibly relocate every Beltway reporter for at least a term of no less than a year to go live with real people. And I think things would be a lot better out there if they did. Anyway, it is so neat to be here with you at this precise moment. One of the great things about this organization is that it does always keep front and center that most basic premise of this great country, freedom. And the greatest threat to our freedom remains, has always been, corrosive government power. And we as a nation have just witnessed exactly that on a very epic scale. 2 weeks ago, we got the Mueller report. And guess what? Surprise, surprise. Bob Mueller did not find that our President of the United States had committed treason by acting as an agent of a foreign power during the 2016 election. He did not find a grand plot, the one that the press had described to us, that involved a 4-star general and a national security advisor aided by a senator from Alabama, facilitated by WikiLeaks, brought into life by Carter Page and Roger Stone to give Putin the keys to the Oval Office. It just wasn't there. Attorney General Bill Barr has meanwhile determined that you cannot commit obstruction of justice by publicly making comments about a non-crime. And you cannot commit obstruction of justice by firing one of the most megalomaniacal FBI heads in the history of the country. Now, when you put it that way, none of this sounds that surprising, right? And for some of us, these findings weren't really all that surprising. For some of us, the past 2 years have been nothing short of surreal. And I speak personally, having reported on this, I feel like the last 2 years I have lived in an extremely poorly written spy novel. None of it ever made any sense, and the only frustration was, in fact, watching how successfully Democrats and their media allies managed to spur all these sensationalist theories for so long. But now it's over, at least in the biggest sense, and that means it's time for a very different kind of inquiry. Because the Mueller findings were so much more than just an exoneration of this president and his campaign. While he may not have put it in so many words, in fact, he didn't put it in any words so far as we know at all in his report, what his report actually is a searing indictment of the FBI and the Department of Justice. And it's time for a reckoning. We need to understand how we got here. How did it come to be that the top echelons of the world's most powerful law enforcement body convinced itself that Donald Trump was the Manchurian candidate, and moreover granted itself, a small group of unelected bureaucrats, the awesome power to take him out? And in some ways, we do already know the basic outlines. We know, I'm pretty sure, I feel pretty confident, how all this got started. And I get asked by a lot of groups, especially by a lot of conservative groups, this was partisan, right? This was a partisan thing. And I actually say no. And I say no because I've always thought as a writer that we need to use words carefully. To say that it was partisan is to say that Jim Comey and Andy McCabe and all of the people sat around and said, you know what, we hate Republicans, we don't like their policies, we don't like Donald Trump's promises of tax reform, we want Democrats in the White House because we like Democrats. That's the true definition of partisan, choosing one party over another. And I can believe a lot about Jim Comey. I mean, believe you me, there's pretty much nothing you could tell me about Jim Comey right now that would surprise me. But I don't actually buy that. I don't think that the evidence points to that being what happened. What it points to, in my mind, is something even worse. What happened, I believe, is that Jim Comey, and I like to call him, by the way, I think we should all call him Saint Jim. Jim Comey had one of the first, if undiagnosed, cases of Trump derangement syndrome in the country. And you know what? He's pretty much admitted as much, okay? If you go out and you listen to his comments that he makes about the president these days, his testimony, his Twitter feed, all of his press rounds, if the deep loathing that he expresses for Mr. Trump is even slightly reflective of the views that he had when he was running the FBI, then we know exactly what happened. Jim Comey looked at Donald Trump. He was willing to believe the absolute worst. He thought, in all of Jim Comey's saintness, that he needed to save the country from a menace, and so he mobilized the entire upper echelons of the most powerful law enforcement agency on the planet against a sitting candidate for the presidency, and then against the president himself after he assumed office. To my mind, that is worse than partisanship, okay? Because that gets to the whole point of corrosive government power. This was a group of functionaries with awesome abilities, awesome powers, believing themselves above the law and above the rules, believing themselves the folks who were actually going to decide who got to run the White House. And all of this, as we know, is further evidence, this mindset, by the very serious discussion after Donald Trump was inaugurated to attempt to remove him by means of the 25th Amendment. We have to use the right word here, and it was a considered coup. That is the only word. So that's one thing we do know. I think we know the circumstances and how this all started. I think we also know that because of this mindset, that the FBI either allowed itself or was an active participant in one of the dirtiest, if most successful, political tricks of all time ever perpetrated in this country. And it was put together by the rival campaign. Now, if you were to listen to the FBI, the story that they have told from the start is that all of this, in fact, started because of a third-tier campaign aide named George Papadopoulos. But this was always the thinnest of reeds and always impossible to credit. We are meant to believe that the entire FBI was mobilized because of a 20-something who nobody had ever heard of, who had no real authority or even any notice in the Trump campaign. He was supposed to have uttered one sentence about Hillary Clinton's emails at a time when everybody on the entire planet was talking about Hillary Clinton's emails. What we do know is that it looks like their actual blockbuster piece of information was an opposition research document crafted by the rival presidential campaign, the infamous dossier, which to this day, not one piece of which has ever been proven to be true. An organization called Fusion GPS took a former MI6 spook, who was also by that time a gun for hire, and got him to write a dossier of scandalous accusations against Donald Trump, based on anonymous Russian sources. And there were glaring red flags when the FBI was presented this, which should have slammed the door in the face of these characters. For starters, even in 2016, anyone in Washington knew that Fusion was a very well-known smear shop who worked for Democrats. Okay, that should have been your first red flag. Meanwhile, Christopher Steele, the dossier author, he goes to the FBI with this work product, all right, and he explains that from the comfort of his London office, because by this point, he had not been in the intelligence business for 7 years. He had not been to Russia in 7 years. But he explains that from his London office, with nothing more than his telephone, he manages to unravel one of the most explosive plots ever, one that every other Western intelligence operation using the most sophisticated spy tools on the entire planet missed. So this is a story a notorious Oppo research firm shops to the FBI, and the FBI actually buys it. And you kind of have to step back and admire how brilliant and how clever this actually was. If you work in Washington, D.C., the congressman can probably back me up on this. When a campaign or a group digs into something that's Oppo research, they have to go and they have to try to sell it to the press, right? And then the press goes and it tries to verify it. And usually if they're maintaining any standards of quality, if they can't back it up, they're not going to run with it. Fusion knew that everything that was in this dossier was too outlandish even for a press corps that hated Donald Trump. So what did they do? They used this supposedly respectable former intelligence agents to instead get their Oppo research into FBI's hands. And once that had happened, they could then leak that fact to the press and thereby give the dossier legitimacy. Isn't that brilliant? So they could say, look, even the FBI is investigating this. It's incredibly serious. And from there, we were off to the collusion races, and it has not stopped ever since. A couple of other things we know. We know that because the FBI understood just how weak it was, that they were going along this route with no real credible evidence, that this wasn't going to pass the bar for a criminal investigation, which is why they took the unprecedented step of opening a counterintelligence investigation into a presidential campaign. Think about this. This is the type of investigation we reserve for terrorists. But they had to do it that way. Why? Criminal investigations, there's rules, there's standards, there's things you have to hit if you want to engage. But with a CI investigation, you can do pretty much anything you want to do, which of course they did. They used human informants. People actually wore wires when they went to interact with folks on the Trump campaign. They obtained national security letters. They tapped telephones. They secretly monitored travel. They rifled through financial records. In short, they treated Trump campaign members the way that we do treat suspected terrorists. Only these people were American citizens. And we know, too, that they obtained secret surveillance warrants from the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court to monitor these citizens. The notion of the federal government surveilling average U.S. folk is anathema to us, and for very good reason. It should not ever happen unless they are the most dire circumstances. And the rules are therefore supposed to be really strict. We've got a FISA court that is supposed to demand the highest standards of evidence. But what we've learned as a course of all of this is that the court was more than willing to trust anything the FBI put in front of it. And we've also learned that the FBI didn't play it straight with that court. It hid from the court the true nature of who was behind the dossier. It obscured the Clinton campaign's role. We know from the former general counsel to the FBI, James Baker, in his testimony in front of the House, that the FBI was absolutely aware of the provenance of the dossier and the fact that it was politically motivated and the fact that it was playing with fire. And it proceeded anyway. To this day, I would note, and this is very important, we have never heard a public word from that FISA court about its views of all this and whether or not it felt it was misled by the FBI. That, in my mind, is a dereliction of duty, and it's an important piece of this story that deserves a lot more attention. We know also that what the FBI was doing, that it understood it was problematic, it was highly explosive, and undoubtedly wrong. How do we know this? Because it broke all the protocols and all the simple common sense and all the duties that would normally attend such a dramatic investigation. Remember, don't forget this, the FBI claimed that, again, it was a lower tier campaign aide potentially working with or being used by the Russians that first got its attention. Jim Comey has said this repeatedly. The FBI keeps insisting that the focus was not the campaign as a whole, that it wasn't Donald Trump, that it was just these few individuals off on the side. I don't really believe that, but the FBI said that from the beginning because it knows it sounds better. Even the FBI doesn't want to admit it was investigating a presidential campaign that early on. It sounds spooky, because it is spooky. So all along, just peripheral figures, right? Well, if that's the case, what's the first thing you do? You give the campaign a defensive briefing, right? This is routine. We had an example of this not long ago with one of your great senators here in California. The FBI had suspicions that the Chinese were trying to recruit a staffer of Dianne Feinstein's. What did they do? They went, they informed her about it, and her office took remedies. The FBI did not do this here, quite the opposite. We have evidence that instead, it actively worked to ensnarl ever greater members of the Trump campaign into its fantasy collusion narrative and trapping them. And Exhibit A, I would mention, is Michael Flynn, the former NSA advisor. The FBI's own records suggest it set him up. It arranged a meeting to lure him into saying something incriminating. And when he didn't do that, in the end, the special counsel ended up reverting to that favorite prosecutorial standby: you lied to the feds. This is an honorable man who served his country for decades, and he is going to jail because of the FBI's delusional collusion thoughts. We also know that they hid this from everybody else, including Congress. which says a great deal, because if you're going to do something this serious, if you truly have reason to believe that a campaign is engaging in treason, you alert other serious people in the highest level of government. That didn't happen. Instead, a group of about a half a dozen bureaucrats, all on their own, with no oversight, set the entire apparatus of executive law enforcement machinery against a presidential campaign. And we also know that they've continued to hide the facts of this ever since, engaging in some of the most outrageous obstruction of congressional oversight in the history of this country. It took former House Intelligence Chairman Devin Nunes 9 months simply to root out the truth that the Clinton campaign had paid for this dossier. The FBI had known all about it from the start. It hid it from Congress. It took him, I think, about 18 months to discover the truth about human informants being run into the campaign. In fact, we only found out 6 months ago. It was the first word we'd got. The astonishing truth that the former FBI Deputy Director, Andy McCabe, in the wake of Jim Comey's firing, had actually initiated an investigation directly into the president himself. It took 2 years for the FBI and the DOJ to come clean about this. In fact, this is important. I think nearly every time we have found out another bombshell revelation in this case, it hasn't come from the FBI and the DOJ to proper authorities, to congressional overseers. Instead, every time it's been because those agencies have leaked their version of the truth to their willing scribes in the press. And at times, they have even broken national security rules to do that. I have an up-close and personal story about this all the way back when there was first some intimations that the FBI had actually used a human informant, or again, words matter, I'll use the correct word, had spied on the Trump campaign. I found out the name of the person who it was. And I did it through a lot of old-fashioned journalism reporting tactics, and I want to be really clear right here on the record, not a single source of mine, not one person in the House, not one Republican ever gave me the name or confirmed the name. No one ever broke classified information rules, because you know what knows nice thing about Republicans? They care about national security. So it was through a number of other methods, but I was 99.9% sure. And I remember going to my boss, Paul Gigot, and I said, I've got this name, what should we do with it? And he goes, look, we should care about national security too. Step back. It's not that important to put that name out there. Say what you know about what happened, but we're not gonna put it out there. We're not gonna go down that road. Also, it was very clear to us, and it had also been suggested to us, that if the Wall Street Journal were to put that name out there, that the DOJ would indeed initiate a classified information criminal investigation into members of Congress and probably into me or others at the paper. That was the threat that was hanging out there. So imagine my surprise after all this the very next day to wake up and see that both the New York Times and the Washington Post had the name of this person on their front page. And who had leaked it to them? The FBI. Because they wanted to get out ahead of the story, right? So here I am, a journalist. I'm following all the rules. I'm trying to protect national security. The FBI itself was willing to blow its own source so that it could get the proper narrative out there with friendly journalism sources. You know, and this is the same press. I have really lost patience for a lot of my colleagues these days. For 2 years, this is a press that entertained the most wild and baseless accusations and presented them as gospel to their readers. You know, think about this for a minute. In light of that story I just told you, we've had 2 years of government using the press as its mouthpiece, laying out its preferred version of events. I can think of other countries where this happened, where they use their state-run media to do it. You tell me how this is any different at the moment. I can't see the difference myself. Nobody should want any of this, and I don't care what side of the aisle you are on. No one should want a teeny tiny group of unelected officials who wield enormous power, who have the ability, as we have seen, to utterly roil a political system, who are inoculated from accountability by the secrecy of the work they do, who have long time or even built-in tenures to be making these calls, This was an organization that went rogue. And I keep warning my friends on the other side of the political aisle and in the press, stop justifying this, all right? We've had, over the last couple of years, I think a lot of very thoughtful pieces by a lot of thoughtful writers trying to make a what-if scenario, trying to put this in a different perspective, say, you know, what if this had been the George W. Bush administration doing this to the incoming Barack Obama campaign? And I think those have been very important pieces, but sometimes it's also hard for Americans to reimagine history. So instead of reimagining history, let's play this forward. I keep telling my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, all right, let's move into 2020, okay? Just be aware that according to all of the rules you are now setting out and all of the things that you are justifying, you are going to be good if the Trump campaign puts together an opposition research document into the Democratic nominee and gives it to the Trump FBI and starts an investigation. You good? You all good with that? They're not going to be good with it, obviously, and they'll come up with all kinds of reasons for why it's different. But of course it's the same thing, and it's what they're justifying right now. And this behavior has had true and lasting consequences for the country. I continue to point out, for all of the claims out there that I hear all the time about how supposedly this president is destroying democracy, how he's a budding autocrat, a tyrant. I mean, by the way, how do you be a budding autocrat when you like cut regulations in half? I don't really get that. I don't, there's so many things about this story that never make sense. I also have never been able to get anybody who believed in this conspiracy theory to explain how they can both claim that Donald Trump is the most disorganized, undisciplined president in the history of the country and pulled off the biggest treasonous plot ever that nobody ever found out about. I mean, some of these things just don't add up, right? But for all of these people who keep making these claims that he is the worst thing that ever happened to this country, I will make the case that it is the Trump haters and those who are resisting him who are doing the most damage to our institutions on our daily basis. They've utterly destroyed faith in institutions. Look right now, on one side, we still have a significant portion of Americans who, even after Mueller, believe Trump is a foreign agent and that everything he does is illegitimate. That is a sorry state for a democratic country to be in. And there have another side, again a significant portion of the country, that no longer believe anything the FBI or the Department of Justice does. They are convinced that all of this was a plot, an attempted coup against the man that they wanted in the White House, and they understand all the problems that happened in those investigations. And let's be clear, too. Congressman Biggs mentioned this, or the introduction about Bob Mueller. He has not helped things, all right? Special counsels are never a good idea. And I know that Lindsey Graham is out calling for one now. I would resist that because prosecutors, the big problem with them is that they never feel they can do anything until they've actually indicted someone, put someone in jail. A lot of innocent people get swept up with that. I also think we need the truth right now, rather than 2 more years of a black hole where we're not going to hear anything. Bob Mueller himself has a lot to answer for. I agree that given his time that he was at the FBI, that he was too conflicted to have ever taken this job. Especially because it's become very clear that a great deal of what happened, especially after Donald Trump was inaugurated and after Jim Comey was fired, that a lot of this was driven by pure animosity and institutional anger over what had happened and over the president's decision to actually clean house at the FBI. And Bob Mueller is a creature of the FBI, right? So it was always pretty clear that he could never take a neutral look at this. And we know that he hasn't. Who can conduct an investigation, by the way, where you investigate a dossier that makes all of these claims, you find those claims not to be true? How do you not go on and investigate the dossier itself and the people who are involved? I just don't understand how that happens. When I go out and I talk to people, and this is a growing concern across the country, the number one thing I hear from people time and again is a growing fear that there is unequal justice in the country. And that has been magnified by this FBI Trump investigation, but by the special counsel himself. Look, again, to ask questions. I'm not sure how you go out. Paul Manafort, look, he was tried and convicted by a jury. I'm not gonna go there. But one of the charges that was brought against him was violating the Foreign Agents Registration Act. All right, and that says you've got to go and register if you lobby or work in any way for a foreign government. Okay, this has been on the books for a long time. There's really never been a successful prosecution of it. The decision by the special counsel to make it a situation in this and actually take someone to trial, put them to jail for it, was new broken ground. Fine, if that's how the Department of Justice wants to change the way this statute has always been handled, that is their right. But how can you go and put Paul Manafort in jail for that and not Glenn Simpson, who works for Fusion GPS? I don't understand that. So I think it's crucial, again, that we now have a reckoning, that we get to the truth, and we set things in motion for this reason alone, so that this never happens again. Because for all that we do know, there's still plenty we don't know. And some of it I predict, I think, will be even more scandalous. You know, how many Americans were in fact targeted with FISA warrants in the end? I can make a pretty good prediction it wasn't just one. It wasn't just Carter Page. Again, the other question is, you know, we know that there were human informants who were interacting with Trump officials, but when did that actually happen? They say their investigation didn't start until July 31st, 2016. We know some of these guys were interacting with the Trump campaign before then. How involved was Fusion with the FBI? What role did former or current members of British intelligence play in all this? What role, by the way, did CIA Director John Brennan or former DNI James Clapper have in all this? Who was doing all the leaking, and who was giving the orders and the unmasking of American citizens? So the good news is, I think that we finally do have the opportunity to get there, to find this out. It cannot be overstated just how important it is that the Mueller investigation is officially done. Democrats and the press, there's going to be bitter enders out there. They're going to keep up the collusion narrative as long as they can. You know, and just this week, we had yet more leaks. Supposed members of the Mueller team aren't happy with Bill Barr's summary of his report. And you've got crazies like Adam Schiff, who insists that everything is evidence of collusion. But what matters is that the actual mechanics of this investigation have finished. And that means that finally, for the very first time since taking office, it gives the Trump administration the latitude to actually delve into this investigation. Up until now, if they wanted to do that, they were hit with accusations that they were somehow attempting to obstruct the special counsel's probe. Well, that threat is now gone. So we have the president finally saying that he is going to declassify documents that should shed an enormous amount of light on these questions. We've got a Department of Justice Inspector General who I am told is nearing the final ends of his own probe into the FBI's handling of the Trump-Russia investigation. We have South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham announcing that his Judiciary Committee is going to make one of its primary focuses its own far-reaching probe into how all of this started. By the way, one of the more amusing moments, if any of you did not catch this, it's been a long, grueling couple of years, so any moments of funny make me I practically burst into tears laughing. But not long after Bill Barr made his summary of the report public, Jim Comey, in classic Jim Comey style, sent a tweet out of him standing in the redwoods looking at these trees, and he said, "So many questions." And it was so clearly designed to, you know, trash Bill Barr's summary and the findings of the report, make it clear that this is not what Jim Comey, would have come up with. But the best thing ever was Lindsey Graham forwarded that tweet on to So Many Questions, and he said, "Could not agree more. See you soon." So Graham's made clear he's going to bring these people in. He's going to put them under oath, and he's going to make them answer some very hard questions, and that is long overdue. Also, I think there's another really important reason for optimism, and that is, in fact, Attorney General Bill Barr. You know, the only way, if you've been in Washington long enough, you discover this, that the only way you truly address failings at departments or agencies is you put really strong leaders at the top. People who are not institutionalists, people who rather come in and they understand their goal is to take a dispassionate view of this, recognize what went wrong, and then impose some reforms. And for many obvious reasons, that's been impossible for the last couple of years, not just because the Mueller probe was ongoing and there were claims that to take such actions might involve some sort of obstruction or might be in any way interfering with the secrecy of Bob Mueller's probe, but also because Trump opponents had very deliberately, and I want to stress that word, deliberately and successfully managed to drag Jeff Sessions into their collusion narrative and force him to recuse himself. And they knew exactly what they were doing when they did that, because it guaranteed for them for these past 2 years that there would be nobody at the top to address these crucial questions and do anything about this behavior. But hopefully that now changes. In his confirmation hearings, Mr. Barr said it was his intention to take a close look at this. And from his prior history as Attorney General, I think we all have every good reason to believe he will do so. He's a little busy just at the moment. We'll cut him a slack. But I am willing to give him a little bit of time, but only some time. And I think it's important that all of us who are now engaged in this understand that this time to get these answers is not infinite. This false scandal has weighed on Washington now for 2 years, and those who have politically benefited by it would like nothing more to see it continue for the next 18 months. They want to see all of these things remain hidden. They don't want anyone to know about their role and what went on, at least through 2020, in hopes that they then win the White House and then they can deep six the actual truth forever, or at least until a time where nobody cares anymore. And we should not let that happen. We should, all of us, care. The FBI's actions in 2016, both in terms of the Clinton investigation and the Trump investigation, rank as one of the biggest abuses of government power in the history of this country. And if we all do believe in freedom, which I know you all do in this room, then we have to take every step that we can to protect against a repeat. And I do applaud all of you in here. The folks in this room, you are the people who are engaged, you are the people who care, and you are the people who make sure that change does happen. And as a result, as always, it was an honor to get to speak with you tonight, and I thank you.